Hello, thanks for coming to our presentation, Decolonising in, by and through participatory design with political activists in Palestine. I'm Rachel. I'm presenting on behalf of my colleagues and co-authors Reem, Ahmed, Kefah, Owen, Mark and Matt. But first, an acknowledgement of countries.
نعترف ونشكر القائمين بالماضي والحاضر على الأراضي الحدودية في شمال شرق إنجلترا وأراضي فلسطين. بصفتنا أكاديميين نستمتع بامتيازات مختلفة في المملكة المتحدة ولبنان وفلسطين، فإننا نعترف بقصص هجرة أسلافنا وتشابكات بناء وطن وعنف الحكم البريطاني وما نتج عنه من أضرار استعمارية مستمرة. نحن ندرك كيف أدى ذلك إلى خلق امتيازات غير متكافئة والاضطهاد المرتبط بالصراع القائم على الأراضي.
We give thanks to the stewards of the land, both past and present, in the borderlands of northeast England and Palestine. As differently privileged academics from the UK, Lebanon and Palestine, we acknowledge our ancestors' migrant her stories, the entanglements of nation building, violence of British rule, and resulting ongoing colonial harms. We recognise how this has created uneven privileges and oppressions associated with land-based conflicts that this paper speaks to. So as an overview, in the paper and in our presentation, our aim is to unpack and unsettle experiences of decolonising PD praxis, and this is responding to recent calls for acknowledging our ways of being and knowing and interrogating and reporting on these in design. We ask, what does decolonising PD praxis mean when entangled with the geopolitics of international development, land-based conflict and settler colonial violence? And we ask this question in the context of indigenous youth responses to and experiences of house demolition in Palestine. So the rest of the paper, we describe our positionality, geopolitics and corporate politics, the context of working with indigenous Palestinian youth and Bedouin activists, the project aims and timeline, and we finish with a tentative conceptual framework to support different orientations of decolonising for PD praxis, so decolonising in, by and through participatory design. So it's also important to not acknowledge how we are differently constituted through a patchwork of positionalities as Palestinian, Lebanese and British researchers. We therefore experience varying privileges and oppressions that affect how to speak ethically with, to and about Palestinians vulnerable to the threat of house demolition. And experiencing these different geographies through our positionalities creates an unsettling recognition of privilege and uncertainty, and this is pulled in and out of focus in embodied and visceral ways. The physical movement between places and our orientations speak to issues of inequitable corporate politics underpinning this work. And a concrete example of this is when we're physically going to different parts of Palestine, passing through checkpoints that some of us are able or unable to go through without significant fear of questioning. So this is the land that is contested and the site for our project in southern Palestine. Maybe you can see some of the structures that sit within the landscape that make use of the formation of the hills, the herding caves, the long-standing watercourses, and the combination of local and found materials. These and other structures are at threat of demolition and where the youth activists live and work. In contrast, you might notice the houses that sit on top of the hill. These are part of an illegal Israeli settlement. This is fenced off from the indigenous village. These are not at threat of demolition. So some wider context for the landscape. Israel and Palestine was partitioned by the British after the Second World War in 1948. Many Palestinians were displaced, moving to neighbouring Lebanon, Jordan, or zoned into the West Bank and Gaza. On the left is a military map from 1949 showing the newly formed borders, and the West Bank is next to Jordan, and Gaza is by the coast next to Egypt. So in 1993, the West Bank was further divided into 3 distinct zones, A, B, and C. And you can see here in the middle image, activists that we worked with live in Area C. And this is the largest area. The infrastructure here is governed by the Israeli Civil Administration. ICA are responsible for issuing planning permissions. And despite a significant need for new homes in the Area C, the majority of permissions granted are limited. They disproportionately favour Israeli settlements. People who do build without permission face demolition orders, such as this one on the right. These are highly complex multilingual documents in Arabic and Hebrew. They combine British, Israeli, Jordanian, and Ottoman laws. They can be legally contested, but are often difficult to understand, even by professional lawyers who have a good understanding of the language and a good understanding of the context. Court cases are rarely favourable to Palestinian families, and they are very costly. And a house can have a demolition order on it for many years, but residents are not always clear when the order will be acted on. So in this context, for many people living in Area C in the West Bank, the experience of house demolitions and the anticipatory violence and loss of home are closely connected to mass displacement experienced during the Nakba, the catastrophe of 1948. During this time, around 650,000 Palestinians were forcibly displaced from their homes and became refugees when the Israeli state was established. Youth activists describe how they are already refugees. Their ancestors were displaced from the land and moved to the hills of southern Palestine in 1948. Now they are under threat of losing their grazing rights and homes again, with all but 2 houses in their village served with demolition orders. So we began working with a small group of activists in 2017. We received funding late in 2018 and started scoping and piloting project ideas in the first quarter of 2019. And this was to engage young people in dialogue around responses to demolitions. Full project delivery then followed in April 2019. In this paper, we focus only on the scoping and pilot phase. The project was co-developed around 3 main aims: to document and raise the profile of how young people informally respond to demolitions and how it impacts their future aspirations. Share this understanding with INGOs to change interactions within those organisations, who can often position young people as passive victims and recipients of aid, which the activists found deeply problematic. And finally, to build solidarity and capacities for future resistance within neighbouring villages. So as part of the pilot phase with the activists, we co-created a series of prompt questions for young people to respond to. And from this scoping, we were inspired yet troubled by a decolonising agenda in a context where land is contested and settler colonial violence dominates many Palestinian lives. To make sense of what we were trying to achieve, we started to distinguish between different orientations and praxis that came out of our scoping and pilot phase, as requiring different ways of being and doing in these spaces. And in the paper, we position this as a tentative conceptual framework. So decolonising in, responding inward in dialogue to our own background and our training in conversation with our collaborators, and recognising the Eurocentric frames of reference that can still remain prevalent in our work. And in the paper, we talk about this as a dance, the dakbar, which is a traditional Palestinian dance which both highlights struggle, but also solidarity and celebration. In our second orientation, we've described decolonising by, so responding outward as advocate, through creative collaboration as a catalyst for challenging institutional perspectives by bringing to the fore alternative epistemologies and ontologies. And finally, decolonising through, responding to change and sustainment. So mobilising cracks that aim to affect change beyond the research that speak to autonomous and communal forms of action and sociability. So we go into more detail about what each of these orientations mean in the context of decolonising PD in the paper, but in the interest of brevity, we focus here just on one strand, decolonising by So what do we mean by this? So we formally frame this as a challenging organisational perspectives by sharing alternative epistemologies and ontologies otherwise. We also think this is about sensitising as well to organisational perspectives and perceptions of justice that may differ to those of our collaborators, our own expectations as designers and researchers. And a stark example of this was when at a workshop with INGOs that the activists could not travel to due to distance and checkpoint restrictions. As advocates, we presented the work that the young people had been doing to prevent and rebuild after demolitions. We were met with a response that highlighted the necessity of data about demolitions that flattened young people's agency and indigenous identities. And in the paper, we refer to the work of Tuk and Wang that talks about decolonising as a metaphor. At the same time, the organisation felt this practice of data collection and sharing was important to generate particular kinds of support after a demolition had taken place, rather than work on preventative strategies. So in this example here, the representative from the INGO formally highlights what they do in order to support those families and communities that we were presenting their work about. So here they say, we document each demolition within 24 hours of it taking place and collect data and make this accessible to other NGOs who respond by providing shelter and international support. Many organisations work secretly in Palestine because Israel can take equipment. So we have a lot of detailed data as we have worked for many years to organise responses with NGOs as it was chaos. We have data on specifics of gender, children under 18 and adults over 18, but not on youth. So this differed to young people's perceptions of the value of that support being misaligned. When asked to respond to one of the questions about what the most effective forms of resistance was in preventing demolitions, young people often placed INGO support at the bottom. So this example here, where the activists used some of the questions that they developed to ask other young people in their village what the most, to put into a scale, what the most effective forms of resistance were. And this is the youth activist reporting back on some of the things that they found. So they are at the bottom, and that's where he put the INGO projects. He said, I don't need a blanket. I need someone to change the law. And that's what he explained. You know, when they demolish your house, the INGO, they bring you a refugee tent, they bring you blankets, they bring you pillows, he said, but we have enough blankets and stuff. So what we presented was how young people had developed multiple tactics within their communities for prevention, distraction, and disguise to better navigate demolitions that was not recognised in the standardised data collection about demolitions. The contrast of different kinds of support and relevance of information helped to highlight how justice was differently aligned and differently practiced, and how it was understood for the young people experiencing demolitions and the INGOs often working at a distance under significant administrative and surveillance constraints. So to conclude, our aim was to pull focus and unpack potential unsettling geopolitical agendas present in decolonising PD as praxis. We offered 3 decolonising orientations in, by and through, and this was based on one case study. So as a way of distinguishing between different ways of being and knowing, we recognise that this has limits, and there will be many more and not so clear in its distinctions. So we feel it's necessary to continue to question what we perceive as the very fundamental principles of decolonising and its contemporary rhetoric in the context of design as an ongoing form of work. And we finished to ask, what does decolonising PD mean for the day-to-day realities of injustice and inequity? So thank you for listening.